Welcome everybody to today's session of 50 plus Shades of Gothic conference series. Today's session is Ecogothic, Love, Trauma and Othering in the Ecogothic. And our first presentation by Carolina Sánchez-Palencia is titled The Shape of Water, Guillermo del Toro 2017. Cold War America as Amphibian Gothic. So Carolina Sánchez-Palencia is a senior lecturer at the University of Seville and chair of the Department of English and American Literature. Her main areas of interest are gender studies, post-colonial criticism, body theory, and contemporary literatures in English, especially those produced in diasporic contexts. She has published extensively on modernist and postmodernist women authors in the UK as part of her research group Escritoras y Escrituras. She has participated in the research projects funded by the Spanish Ministry of Education, Queer Peripheries, Representations, Corporealities, Geographies, and Material Culture, and is currently involved in the project Queer Temporalities in Anglo-American Culture. Through her scholarly contribution to these projects, she has become strongly concerned about the diverse manifestations of social, cultural, and sexual dissidence. So, Carolina, the floor is yours. You're muted, Carolina.
Okay, sorry. Well, thank you, Dina, and to all the organizers for bringing us on board this thrilling project. I'm going to share my my presentation. Okay. Okay. Okay, here I am. Okay. Most discussions on the Ecogothic agree to identify the genre with a revisitation of classical Gothic tropes, boundaries, transgression, confinement, and monstrosity through an environmental lens that contests speciesist and anthropocentric hierarchies. Simon's talk takes a step further by addressing the tensions between the scientific and the supernatural, between colonialism and nationalism, and between environmental preservation and predatory industrialization. It is precisely at the intersection of such tensions that I situate my analysis of Guillermo del Toro's 2017 film, awarded within the Academy's Best Film and Best Director categories. If in Pan's Labyrinth and in Pacific Rim, the Mexican director employed subterranean creatures and sea monsters as the film's respective sources of terror, in The Shape of Water, he intensifies the Gothic trope of borders by appealing to an amphibian creature as a metaphor of the different forms of hybridization between races, sexes, nations, bodies that was strongly feared and perceived as threatening in Cold War America. Amphibians, a name that means double life or both sides of life, are particularly apt to represent the monstrous and ambivalent nature that inspires the Gothic genre. Not only are they capable of living both in water and on land, but also develop system-shifting functions, and their bodies display features that lie between those of fish and reptiles, while the larvae and tadpoles breathe through external gills, grow flat tails, and feed on vegetation. After the metamorphosis, a biological process that has often inspired Gothic fantasies of transformation, external gills give way to lungs, and their adults change from plant eaters to meat eaters. But most importantly, as indicator species, they provide information on the overall health of the ecosystem and on the changes and conditions of other species within it. With their permeable skins and dependence on easily accessible supply of water, amphibians are more vulnerable than most other animals to endangerment and extinction. It is not a coincidence that as their numbers decrease due to pollution of fresh water and the destruction of humid habitats, so do the number of healthy ecosystems around the world. As bioindicators of the environmental conditions in their habitats, amphibians invite an analogy with Gothic fantasies as symptomatic of the different anxieties in the societies that produce them, or with monsters as embodiments of a certain cultural moment. Again, this is Cohen's definition. In this light, I contend that Del Toro adopts the amphibian Gothic as the best vehicle to reveal the apprehensions about national, sexual, racial, and scientific boundaries in his 1960s Once Upon a Time in America. Though in one of the scenes, a car salesman announces that the future is green, the symbolic color palette of the film's historical setting designates a series of paranoid fears about non-wasps and objectified others. Red Scare, Black Scare, Lavender Scare are the ideological backdrop against which Del Toro explores the moral panic about communists, non-whites, and homosexuals who were seen as a threat to national security and thus placed under governmental surveillance. Although the amphibian creature is none of these, his vulnerability aligns him with other undesirable specimens of his new ecosystem. Eliza, the orphan mute cleaner, Zelda, her Afro-American co-worker, Giles, the gay neighborhood, or Dr. Hofstadter, the preservationist Russian scientist. All of them subjected to the racial, sexual, and political violence embodied by brutal and archetypal Wasp Strickland, the security supervisor. Considering the interspecies miscegenation in the film, I'm not going to refer to Eliza and the amphibian man's love story that I think has been addressed and discussed in another paper. I want to point out that it challenges the laws against racial miscegenation that were not declared unconstitutional in the US until the late 1960s. By the same token, both the creature's cross-species corporeality in between a scaly reptilian and a bipedal human, and Eliza's mutedness served to contest ableist theories about bodily purity that went rampant during decades, resulting in thousands of Americans with disabilities being passed over for jobs, forbidden to live in certain neighborhoods, and denied housing developments. Eliza outsidedness situates her at the side of those aberrant creatures, Blacks, homosexuals, communists, non-human, confronting Strickland's ethnic absolutism and proper environment. Nevertheless, her communication impairment that, interestingly enough, alienates her from her speaking others and leaves her as a fish out of water, is compensated by her independence, determination, and self-confidence. If allegedly physical boundaries in the Gothic serve to remind us of the untrustworthy nature of other boundaries, then Eliza Esposito hybrid condition in between human and non-human, woman and fish, helps dismantling anthropocentric and speciesist hierarchies. When in the final scene of the film, the amphibian creature touches her scars, visible signals of her difference, this open to reveal the gills that she needs for her rebirth in the ocean. Against the backdrop of eugenics in 20th century US, enforced through sterilization campaigns until 1963, her disability proves to be, in fact, a misrecognition of her different, diverse, hybrid amphibian qualities. The blurring of self and other, so consistently explored in Gothic narratives, extends also to geographical boundaries, where everything within the limits of the civilized world is perceived as good, and everything beyond it is seen as either exotic or dangerous. This idea is quite significant in an explicitly nationalistic and imperialistic period as the Cold War years. Remember that the monster is taken from the Amazon in a clear reference to the US colonialist exploitation. The motivation behind its capture and investigation is to rival the Soviet Union and the domination of the space. According to Shannon Payne, Guillermo del Toro questions the narrative of progress shaping Cold War America. And while he sets the film against the background of the Great Acceleration, he simultaneously denounces the slow violence as effect of the systemic exploitation inherent to the Anthropocene, a process, this is slow violence, that can be defined as, quote, the violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. In the film, scientific and economic progress is unequivocally associated to violence. The creature that is going to be vivisected in the nuclear research facility was found while drilling for oil in the Amazon, where the indigenous communities were deprived both of their habitat and of the creature they worshipped as a god. But to such an extent is this exercise of colonial dispossession affecting disenfranchised subjects inextricably linked to the American dream of possession, that Del Toro depicts middle-class unrestrained consumerism as the basis for the nation's economic progress. In this light, his exploitation of the Anthropocene seems to be complicated by the consideration of the environmental crisis motivated by the demands and excesses of capitalism and its belief in a cheap and appropriable nature. The Capitalocene, a term coined by Jason Moore, addresses precisely systemic forms of oppression like class or empire, neglected by the Anthropocene scholars, who have tended to blame the species, anthropos, the undistinguished entire humanity, and not the system. Moore's proposal to reformulate Anthropocene as Capitalocene, the age of capital, for making sense of capitalism as a whole ecology of power and production is worth considering. Besides, Moore argues, there has been little room in the anthropos for anyone not white, male, or bourgeois. So the problem is not man and nature, but certain men committed to the profitable domination and destruction of most humans and the rest of nature. Though Del Toro might seem to share this approach, his critique is not only targeted at the exploitative dimension of capitalism stricto sensu, since the communist Soviet Union represented in the film is also engaged in the predatory expansionism implied in the Cold War and the related space race. Del Toro's filmography tends to emphasize the monstrous condition of humanity, featuring characters that are far more brutal and voracious than those non-human creatures at the other side of our imagination. That the creature and Strickland, the wicked supervisor, inaugurate the story by entering the laboratory together, contributes to this confusion and implies an evocation of Kristeva's notion of the object, as dismantling the distinction between self and other, between the familiar and the foreign. But apart from Strickland, representing these different forms of violent domination, racist, sexual, speciesist, ableist, what is predominantly depicted as monstrous in The Shape of Water is human interaction with nature, manifested through the socio-ecological violence of practices such as extractivism, pollution, militarization, and vivisection. Seen from an eco-Gothic perspective, the amphibian man, brutally extracted from the Amazonian rainforest for unethical experimentation, stands as the uncanny signifier of an environmental unconscious, revealing those forms of environmental violence that have been occulted. Drawing on Shara Dekad, I contend that Del Toro's approach is not ecophobic, that is, it does not rely on the notion of a malevolent and vengeful nature that threatens civilization and order, but critically eco-materialist in his consideration of the wider geopolitical contexts intersecting with environmental catastrophe. In this vein, the film could be interpreted as a revisitation, and I quote from Deckard, of the earlier significations of Gothic nature, reversing the valence of green monsters in order to embrace their capacity for transgression, or to attribute the source of the terror to the unjust operations of power. The amphibian mode as a metaphor of permeable, fluid, and vulnerable lives seems to inspire Italian writer Gino Pitaro's Bubblefish, Tales from the Aquarian Age, where against the violence of impenetrable systems, be they minds, nations, or bodies, he advocates for the intersection with others and for the cultural osmosis at the heart of our different and yet equal lives. Filmed within the context of Donald Trump's political toxicity and set in the similarly racist and xenophobic years of Cold War America, The Shape of Water, reviewed as a hybrid story in its genre fluid blending of horror, monster, musical, jailbreak, video, spy, romance styles, proposes the amphibian Gothic as resistance to the philosophy of making America great again, inspiring both historical moments. Del Toro's creatures, Payne argues, crawl from their places of confinement to assert their inhuman subjectivities. But nevertheless, in their encounters with humans, they serve to question all sorts of boundaries between and within us, and to reveal our unspeakable desires and our paranoid anxieties. Thank you. Okay, so thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carolina, very much for your amazing presentation. And now we're going to move on to our next presenter, Alissa Berger, who is going to present Ecogothic Trauma in Carmen Maria Machado, Dani and Tamra Bonvillen's The Low Woods. So Alissa Berger is an associate professor of English and director of student success at Culver-Stockton College in Canton, Missouri, in the United States. She teaches courses in research, writing, and literature, specializing in gender, horror, and the Gothic. She is the author of The Quest for the Dark Tower, Genre and Interconnection in the Stephen King series, Teaching Stephen King, Horror, the Supernatural, and New Approaches to Literature, full grade 2016, and The Wizard of Oz as American Myth, a critical study of 6 versions of the story, McFarland 2012. So Alissa, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. And just a big thank you in general to PopMech, like in this year where we've been able to do so little of sharing our scholarship, sharing our work with one another. I know I've really enjoyed being able to tune into these panels over the last several weeks. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. All right. So Carmen Maria Machado's The Low Woods, with art by Dani and color by Tamra Bonvillain, was one entry in Joe Hill's curated limited run of Hill House Comics under the DC Black Label imprint in 2019 and 2020, with each narrative featuring diverse approaches to horror, a range of artistic styles, and luminary voices from both literature and comics. The Low Woods focuses on 2 young women, V and L, and you can see that their names are shortened from the more traditional feminine Octavia and Eldora, and their lives in the wonderfully gothically named Shudder to Think, Pennsylvania, a town that exists on top of a series of smoldering subterranean coal mines, evoking the real-life town of Centralia, Pennsylvania in the United States and the Gothic narratives it has inspired, including the Silent Hill series of video games and film adaptations. In addition to the coal mines and the ever-present threats of danger and disintegration they pose, the Gothic landscape of Shudder to Think expands beyond the scope of the mines themselves, including monstrous figures that roam the woods, and the frequency with which the town's women find themselves losing significant chunks of their memories and waking up in strange places. At the opening of the comic, V and L have some of these missing spaces in their own memories, and throughout the narrative, they work to solve these mysteries and to uncover the town's dark secrets. The Ecogothic draws our attention to the complicated and often violent relationship between humans and the natural world, with nature often appearing as both victim and antagonist. While often that antagonism takes the form of nature striking back against humans as punishment for environmental disruption, as argued by Rust and Souls, it can also take the form of a formidable and threatening landscape, such as the deep, dark woods into which Little Red Riding Hood and so many other heroic and ill-fated protagonists alike have ventured. In the Ecogothic, the uneasy intersection of the human and nature, civilization and wilderness also often plunge us into a state of category crisis, where humans might find themselves to be the most monstrous beast in the wilderness. Finally, the natural world is frequently a site of testing and discovery, one which often reveals a specifically Gothic truth in what Alan Lloyd Smith identifies as the return of the past, of the repressed and denied, the buried secret that subverts and corrodes the present. Whatever the culture does not want to know or admit, will not or dare not tell itself. In the Low Woods, Ecogothic takes this wide range of forms, and the relationship between the people of Shudder to Think and the land on which they live is complicated and contentious. For decades, the mines provided the people with a productive living, but the price they pay is high. Many of the townspeople live near enough to open shafts to be constantly breathing in toxic emissions, and miners are killed in explosions. The devastation escalates when the mine catches fire. As Elle reflects while passing through the town cemetery, here, every headstone represents someone's sacrifice to the town, someone killed in the mines, swallowed by a sinkhole, dead of carbon monoxide poisoning. Nowhere and no one in Shudder to Think is safe from the danger of the mines or the exploitation of the natural world they represent. There are also further dangers in the woods that surround the town, with the monsters who attack humans who venture into the forest. The eco-Gothic trauma of the Low Woods is also a specifically eco-feminist trauma, the central claim of which is that the destruction of nature and the historical oppression of women are deeply linked. The women and the land are physically linked as well, with the women literally embodying the mine's sinkholes, a category crisis of epic proportions that aligns the women with the land and its destruction, making them monstrous. And on the left there, you see Jessica, one of the characters' love interest, and she comes back after they've had an intimate encounter and sees Jessica with the sinkhole. And on the right, we see Jessica's mother, who's in a more advanced state of this sinkhole condition. As for the women's lost memories, they're categorized, classified, and dismissed. The way it's explained is environmental dementia, doctors told them. Something in the air, maybe, or the water. And we see these inset texts here, the captions in that blocky yellow, those blocky yellow boxes. And as we'll see as we look at some of the color patterns as we move forward, that yellow is really indicative of the past and talking about the past, thinking about the past of Shudder to Think. But we see that yellow, the past, definitely overlaps with and is inseparable from the present, as we see Elle riding her bike and those yellow captions, those yellow blocks in the present as well. It is in the explanation that there's something in the water that the true horror comes to light in the combination of the natural world and human evil. As a review in Publishers Weekly explains, as they dig deeper, they realize Shudder to Think's cruelties and erasures and the grotesque creatures in its woods share a nefarious connection. As it happens, in this place where a fire has burned for years underground, humans can be the worst monsters. On a hillside above the town is a cistern full of water that erases the short-term memory of anyone who drinks from it, an inexplicable River Lathe-like font that the men of Shudder to Think use to rape the women and cover up these assaults. However, just as nature robs these women of their memories, it also holds the key to returning them, as the local witch discovers a wild mushroom, the Anamnesis suncap, that when distilled, returns the memories that have been repressed. And in this left panel here, we see the witch who's talking to Elle and V, and she's telling them about her own childhood experiences and her process of remembering. And so we see those warm oranges and yellows that tie us back to the past, but we also see that kind of pale red pink in the upper right hand of that left image that we'll see connects to memory. And on the right-hand panel, we see kind of the comparison and contrast, again, between that past and the present. We have the yellow, we have the darker orange of the panel with the birds, the panel with the broken gate going into the woods, and we see their responses to the story that she's telling. Again, really powerfully connecting the past and the present. The interconnection of trauma, memory, and the natural world is complex and multi-layered. As the witch tells Elle and V, I wonder if, deep down, some part of me was singed with, if not the flame of his cruelty, the smolder of it. If that blank part of me was made blank enough that she became someone. If she had somehow passed on a piece of wisdom to my waking self, a whisper of truth. Similarly, though Elle does not remember being raped when she wakes up in the movie theater, she almost immediately throws up, with both the witch's reflection and Elle's vomiting emphasizing the ways in which trauma can be repressed, though on some level, both the mind and the body remember. Through this discovery of her own trauma, the witch herself becomes part of the monstrous Ecogothic, as in an attempt to save the women of Shudder to Think from similar memories and alleviate their suffering, she transforms them into hybrid creatures. Women become synthesized with trees, rabbits, and deer, while others, as we have already seen, embody the mind's sinkholes. She also curses the men, who become monstrous but still not contained, returning as the skinless monsters who hunt the forest. Her spell inadvertently sets the fire that ignites the mind as well, with all of these Ecogothic anomalies that shape Shudder to Think being traceable back to the town's pattern of violating both the land and the women. The Ecogothic trauma of the Low Woods is inseparable from the ecofeminist trauma, with the violence and exploitation of the land directly mirrored in the men's abuse of women and later in the synthesis of women with nature itself. Machado, Dani, and Bonvillain also foreground a wide range of difference in these representations, narratively and visually underscoring the fact that some places are more easily exploited and some bodies are more endangered than others. Both Elle and V are queer. Similarly, the two young women who remember being raped within the scope of this particular narrative, Elle and Jessica, are queer. V is Black and Elle is Latinx. The witch is ageless and maintains a childlike appearance, presenting a symbolic consideration of bodily difference. Within this complex perspective, in addition to the monster-based and Ecogothic horrors, Caitlin Roseberg notes that in the comic, there's also the horror that comes with the day-to-day existence of anyone who isn't male. The fears large and small that come with interacting with men who feel entitled to the bodies of women, but also their time and attention, extracting a long death instead of a quick, violent one. By doing that, Machado links this comic gracefully to a long line of horror like The Awakening and Shirley Jackson's intimate, terrifying stories of all the ways women can be killed. And The Awakening in particular is a text that Machado really overtly returns to time and again. These multiple perspectives and considerations foreground the interconnection of the Ecogothic and the ecofeminist, the power of nature and the abuse of that power by the men of Shudder to Think, compounded by the girls' realization that their fellow townspeople have been aware and complicit all along. And the lesson was not don't do what they did, it was don't get caught, further compounding the abuse. Following her conversation with Elle and V, the witch reconsiders her choice and the synthesis of women in nature that her actions have caused, following V's angry questioning of why did you think you could decide their fates for them? Why didn't you just ask them what they wanted? Why didn't you give them a choice? In the end, the women's agency is returned to them, with each individual woman able to choose for herself. V and L work with the witch to make dual vials that read, to remember what you've forgotten, eat me, with a piece of the restorative mushroom, and to forget that you've forgotten, drink me, with a potion that will smooth the edges of their fragmented memories and help them forget that they've forgotten something. As Machado writes, some chose to remember, as we see there on the bottom left, and some chose to forget, as we see on the right, while others choose to remain as they are. The graphic novel format is ideally suited to exploring the key themes of repression and memory in the Low Woods. The combination of text and image takes readers into the experience of returning memory. And we have, again, that panel of the witch's returning memory on the right there, or on the left. And on the right, we see V and L with that kind of really light red pink of trying to delve into their memories. And this is right after they woke up in the movie theater and they're trying to remember what happened. The use of color helps the reader navigate between past and present, as well as underscoring the interconnection between the two. And here are just a couple other panels that illustrate that use of the yellow and the orange and those kind of ragged edge caption panels, inset panels that connect us between past and present. Scott McLeod addresses the multiple uses of gutters between panels in navigating the text from moment to moment, action to action, subject to subject, scene to scene, and aspect to aspect. Danny's intentional use of the gutters in the Low Woods embraces what McLeod refers to as a silent dance of the seen and the unseen, the visible and the invisible, mirroring what the women remember and what they have forgotten, as well as their awareness that something is missing, even when they're not able to identify just what it is. The reader's process echoes the women's process of remembering, with the reader engaged in the active narrative construction. The artistic visual style also reflects the tone of the women's experiences, with the publisher's weekly reviewer noting that the eerie, sketchy art by Dani suits the mood. Her brooding figures skirt the edge of disappearance, further emphasizing the women's silenced voices and lost memories. The final pages use visual design to subvert the expectation of narrative closure, instead providing horizontal panels that show readers the layers beneath the layers, going all the way down to the memories and horrors which lie beneath, reminding us that when it comes to the Gothic, whatever is buried, whether physically or psychologically, can and will always come back. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alissa. It was really, really interesting. And now we're going to move on to our next presenter, Cristina Baniceru, whose presentation is Ecophobia, the Gothic Sublime and the Puritan Female Body in the Witch, 2015. So Cristina is a lecturer, PhD at the West University of Timișoara, Romania, in the Department of English Language and Literatures. Her broader research interests cover Gothic literature, narratology, and academic writing. So, Cristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, my paper or my presentation focuses on the witch. Just briefly a bit about the plot. So the witch is writer-directed Robert Eggers' debut feature. Is set in New England around 1630, so 17th century. A farmer is banished from his colonial plantation following a religious dispute and moves with his family to a faraway a plot of land on the edge of a forest. Strange things, of course, start to happen. The animals turn violent, the crops rot, the baby Sam disappears, and then the other children, Caleb as well, especially the male children. Caleb disappears as well, only to return naked, seemingly possessed by an evil spirit. And as everybody's suspicion verges on paranoia, they begin to accuse, of course, their teenage daughter Thomasin of witchcraft, which she, of course, denies. So this is the plot in a nutshell, without the spoiler, not yet. So the claim, my claim, so what I really want to demonstrate is that the witch described a Gothic encounter between the human, the Puritans, and the non-human, nature with a capital N, wilderness, the forest, in which the boundaries between the two of them are slowly being erased, giving way to paranoia and loathing, but also with a sort of fascination in the face of the unknowable. The female character, the adolescent Thomasin, becomes slowly the embodiment of both the abject non-human and the so-called corruptible human. So slowly she merges with nature and she becomes the witch. First of all, I'm going to briefly, you are all familiar with this terminology. Ecophobia by Astok was initially labeled because he felt that eco-criticism focuses a bit too much on the positive aspects of nature, positive encounters with natures, or describes nature favorably. So he came up with this term, ecophobia, which is an irrational, groundless hatred of the natural world. A similar term is dark ecology by Timothy Morton, or Gothic nature by Hillard, to express our, and I'm quoting Hillard, cult fascination with the hostile and deadly aspects of nature. And also, all these critics consider the Gothic the perfect tool to investigate or analyze the negative portrayals of nature. Of course, we also have the Eco-Gothic by Smith and Hughes. They coined this term in 2016 to examine nature's darker aspects as a sort of space of crisis that is completely different from the nature we encounter in transcendentalist texts. What is the relevance of talking about ecophobia and fear of nature? Well, we experience a growing ecological crisis, and one of our main cultural anxieties is our troubled relationship with the environment. I'm going to focus on the forest, because in the VVitch we do have a forest, and the forest is one of our landscapes of fear. I'm quoting human geographer Chuan. Also, because we feel somehow, because it's a strange place, because it's unknown, because it's dark, chaotic. Also, Elizabeth Parker comes up with 7 reasons why we fear the forest. First of all, because it's the complete opposite of civilization. This is how we see it, because it's bound to our fears of the past emerging and overcoming us. It's also a place of trial, of testing, a place where we are lost, a place that is associated with the unconscious, a place where we can be eaten, consumed. And also it is an anti-Christian environment, that is, and this description clearly fits my discussion of the VVitch and the Puritans, because the forest is associated with sinful nature, with a sinful nature in general, and nature, human nature. Well, what Gladwin, the Gothic, and Mishra, the Gothic Sublime, are also quite important for me, because they don't talk only about phobia and our fear of nature. They also talk about our fascination with nature, this negative pleasure, almost negative pleasure we feel in the face of nature. We are confronted, when we are confronted with nature. It's talking about the Gothic Sublime. The Gothic Sublime is in many ways the voice from the crypt that questions the power of reason, the voice that wishes to write the narrative of the gap, in which reason for the moment gives way to the chaos as the mind embraces the full terror of the sublime. This is the feeling that we have when we see the forest in the VVitch. It's also about the soundtrack. It's a combination of the angle, the filming angle, and the soundtrack. It creates this mixture of dread and fascination and mystery. Or this negative pleasure. Also, closer to when Kristeva defined the abject. She said that the abject is always edged with the sublime, and this is true also for the witch, where nature, but also the female characters, are somehow a mixture between, you know, dread, fear, but also fascination and sexuality. One other important notion is the transcorporeality that initially came from Del Principe, where he analyzed the Ecogothic as the construction of the Gothic body, unhuman, non-human, transhuman, post-human, or hybrid. Well, and also it is very much connected to Clarke's ecofeminism. The construction of nature and the historical oppression of women are deeply linked. Also, Elizabeth Parker argues that the forest is made animate, through its intimacy with women. Monstrosity is strongly tied to an explicit female sexuality, and this is very true for the witch, for this movie. Everything is connected. Humans are part of the material world. About the Puritan body, because we are talking about Puritan women, and the witch is a Puritan adolescent, or she will become the witch. First of all, it's very important to say that the colonists brought with them the European deep-seated fears of wilderness and to the new continent. This also reminds me of the very famous, quote from William Bradford: "What could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men when they first arrived to the new continent?" Elizabeth Rice says that the fear of witches is closely related to the religious culture of New England Puritanism. Women's bodies were considered weaker vessels through which Satan could reach the soul. Thus, women were more likely to fall under Satan's spell. Her easily penetrable body allowed her to become either the wife to Christ or a drudge to Satan. I repeated Satan so many times that I'm afraid I might actually summon him. And women as witches are actually threatening because their souls made a conscious decision to be with Satan and did not want to be just passive vessels for Christ, made a conscious decision to follow Satan. Here I have some quotes from the witch. So first of all, I'm going to focus on the forest. In the forest, in the witch is the complete opposite of civilization. I'm not saying that civilization is welcoming in the witch, not at all. When they leave the community, and the gates of that settlement are closing, we can actually see some of the first settlers, a combination of races, a combination of people, and they all look somehow hostile. But the danger in the woods is faceless. The woods do not have a face. And we also have this fear of being lost and fear of being tested, because the woods are associated with sin, with the human nature. Nature itself is fallen. The forest is the territory of the devil. Children are prevented from going in the forest all the time. It's that anti-Christian space I was talking about versus the Garden of Eden. It's a place of damnation. then also it's a very the evil in the forest is also contagious. This is a very Gothic trope. It spreads, it affects the land, the crops, the children, the couple, and finally the young female protagonist. Nothing grows on that land. So sinful wilderness represented by the goat, Black Philip, the family's goat, is actually Satan, and it represents, you know, the uncontrollable forces of nature. We also have all these shocking animals where nature is seen as malicious, as evil, filtered through the eyes of the family, who is constantly afraid of this original sin of eternal damnation. So we have a rabble that nibbles at the mother's nipple. So she's feeding a raven and imagining she's feeding her missing baby. We have the old crone, an old crone, a witch, laughing and suckling and munching at the goat's udder. Black Philip, the family's goat, stabbing William, the father of the family. And also Caleb encounters a witch in the forest that lives in a den that looks very, very voluptuous, but then turns into this old crone. It's also that the constant fear of being eaten and consumed by wild animals, but not only. So when Caleb encounters the witch in the forest, she kisses him ferociously, leaving a mark next to his mouth. Because the forest, and I'm quoting here Elizabeth Parker, is traditionally filled with voracious monsters. So the forest is constantly Gothicized by the settlers, constantly associated with the original scene. But as I said, nature is monstrously attractive. Even though they are constantly told not to go in the forest, the children want to go there, and also the father of the family. So there is some sort of attraction there. Just like, you know, the body of the witches and the forest that are a mixture between, as I said, a sexual, voluptuous body, but also the old crone, because she can turn into an old woman and then from an old woman to a young woman. And this is also, as I said, the family puts the blame on Thomasin, the female character, the female adolescent, because she's also this beautiful woman, booming sexuality. She's adolescent. She's starting to turn into a woman, and this is the moment when she becomes the witch. As I said, witches are not passive. They make a conscious choice that gives them agency. Even though Thomasin chooses to ally with Satan, this decision opens a new world for her, a world made only of women, devoid of male presence. Okay. A sort of feminist world in a way, where they can actually be free. The director named the witch the anti-mother. So witches are anti-mothers. They are portrayed as killer of babies, just like Dracula's brides, because they refuse their maternal role. Actually, just before becoming a witch, she has a fight with her mother, and she doesn't want that, but she kills her mother, and this is the last member of the family, thus breaking off her family ties. First of all the males in the family die. So first of all the male authority is killed by nature or by the devil, and then the mother, in fact, accuses her of seducing her brother. And we do have here some the dialogue between the mother and the daughter just before the daughter kills her and frees herself. Well, I think I'm a bit late. So what I was trying to demonstrate is that besides this Gothic encounter between the family, the Puritans, and nature, wilderness, and forest, we also have the female character that slowly. So initially she's quite innocent, but she's constantly accused of witchcraft. She's accused by her own father and then by her own mother of witchcraft, of being an easy woman. So she makes a conscious choice of joining nature, of becoming a free person, but nonetheless a witch. She melts away into the forest. This is one of the last images we see her going to the forest naked to start a new life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for your presentation. And now our last presenter today is Katrina Jones. She's an ABD PhD candidate in Western University's Department of English. Her research investigates the intersections of genre, noir, hard-boiled, and climate fiction. An article on the conventions of noir in Kim Stanley Robinson's Climify New York 2040 is forthcoming in an edited volume. And her presentation is titled The Absent Present African American in American Gothic Literature. So Katrina, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for your presentations. They were really interesting. So I guess my presentation, I would just like to start off by saying, is the research that I did for it is in its formative stage. So any sort of discussion surrounding it will be really helpful, especially for my upcoming research on noir and cli-fi. Yeah, so I don't have a PowerPoint. I do apologize. It's very unlike me. Usually I'm like staying up all night, like coming up with cool visuals, but maybe it's the heat or the exhaustion from the school year. I'm just like, okay, I'll talk. So for today's presentation on both the absence and presence of the African American body in American Gothic literature, I will first examine the ways in which Black imagery in Washington Irving's 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, limits the African American presence to one that is on the peripheral of the narrative. So in other words, how the African American presence is used primarily as a medium in both its presence through actual characters in the story and absence. That is, the presence melts into the atmosphere and landscape of the narrative. So the simultaneous presence absence of the African American body reinforces Toni Morrison's idea of the Africanist presence in Playing in the Dark. So Morrison argues that Black bodies are objects for mediations on terror and exist as shadows that always, quote, hover at implication and sign in line of demarcation, end quote. So in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, there are instances of metonymic displacement, which include color coding that displace rather than signify the Africanist character. So following an examination of Irving's short story, I want to examine Morrison's own use of color in her novel Beloved, which I think a previous panel had discussed Beloved as well. But I will specifically focus on how she speaks back to or engages in what Henry Louis Gates Jr. calls signifying upon the Anglo-American Gothic tradition that sought to fetishize the African-American body and deploy the Africanist presence in a way that gave Anglo-American identity the ground to define itself. So rather than relying on blackness, Morrison uses whiteness, a color that is to her, quote, mute, meaningless, unfathomable, pointless, frozen, veiled, curtained, dreaded, senseless, implacable, end quote. I love that quote. I had to put that quote in there. Just, it's so powerful. So, you know, going forward in our own research in the Eco-Gothic, I think this analysis of color imagery can be really useful in how we understand different anxieties and tensions that emerge between bodies and nature. So the legend of Sleepy Hollow is about hauntings and supernatural occurrences and a love triangle between Ichabod and Brom Bones over Katrina. Sleepy Hollow's atmosphere is mysterious and it's full of ghosts, and the legend goes that such a town was bewitched during the early days of the Dutch settlement. So the town's history of settlers and active colonization, genocide, is one cause of anxieties and characters. Throughout the narrative, there are supernatural events that question the senses of both the reader and resident characters in the story. What I'm interested in is the ways in which anxiety over a Dutch past, over sexuality, that is in this love triangle, and over the African-American body is depicted as evil and menacing by using Black imagery. In Ralph Ellison's essay, 20th Century Fiction and the Black Mask of Humanity, he argues that historically, quote, the color black is associated with evil and ugliness, end quote. So in this essay, he discusses ways in which blackness serves as a metaphor for the buried psychology of all things dark. He argues that Anglo-Americans attribute to African-Americans qualities they wish to be disassociated from, such as anger, passion, sexuality. So take, for example, the following instances of Black imagery in Irving's short story to create an atmosphere of evil and hauntings. There's Brom's curly black hair. There's Ichabod's black suit. There's the twittering blackbirds. There's the woodpecker's broad black gorget. There's a deep black part of the stream, and again referred to as the black water. There's the black horse of powerful frame, and again referred to as the black steed. Now consider one of a couple of scenes in which the African-American body is depicted in the story. Namely, I'm interested in the scene when some African-Americans have gathered. They are described as, quote, a pyramid of shining black faces at every door and window, gazing with delight, end quote, with their eyes, quote, rolling white eyeballs, and grinning rows of ivory from ear to ear, end quote. The over-exaggerated image would soon become reified in minstrel shows and sambo dolls, for example. So these black colors are tightly interwoven with the blackness of African-American bodies in the text. So just as the color black serves a metaphorical purpose, an aesthetic purpose, so too the African-American bodies in the narrative do. They do that as well. That was a poorly framed sentence. So in other words, the color black exists in the peripheral of the narrative, A, to categorize and identify the African-American body from the Anglo-American characters, and two, as a way to give, to give characters a way to express their anxieties and the evilness that surrounds them. So moving on to Beloved, Morrison herself echoes the aforementioned argument by Ralph Ellison in her book Playing in the Dark. She argues that the Africanist presence is deployed in a savage way to give Anglo-American identity the ground to define itself. So Morrison herself tries to invert this tradition in her novel Beloved by focusing on white colors of objects as signs of evil. Morrison focuses on whiteness as a defining feature of landscape and objects in African-American Gothic literature. Her focus on such is inverted to the same effect Irving deploys darkness and blackness in his short story. So just a little brief overview of the novel, if you haven't read it or aren't familiar with it. It is inspired by the real-life incident of Margaret Garner, an African-American slave who fled to the Free State of Ohio in 1856, only to be captured, but not before she kills her daughter to avoid her daughter being stolen away and forced into slavery. The novel itself is set after the American Civil War, but it's published in the late 80s. And it tells the story of a family of former slaves whose house is haunted by Sathe, who is the mirror image of Garner, her daughter, beloved. So with that sort of brief little overview, let's dig into some examples of color imagery that we can juxtapose to Irving's Gothic tale. So the atmosphere of the character's house, 124 on Bluestone Road, is gray and white rather than black, gray, and just very highly Gothic. Furthermore, the inside of the house contains a white staircase, luminous white railing, and a blue and white wallpaper. There's no black water, black animals, or other aesthetic uses of the color black to help characters make sense of their oppressive past as slaves and potential anxieties arising out of their relationship with pastoral, with their environment. For example, when in book 1, a character's eyes are described as black, they're likened to the beauty of the, quote, all-night sky. So this is one instance of the color black used in Beloved in a way to associate the color with power and positive, beautiful attributes, as opposed to the way blackness is used in Irving's short story. Another difference between the two texts is the cause of the haunting presence itself and the anxieties. While it's the Dutch settlement and other tales that serve, as historical events that instill anxiety in the characters in Irving's story, it is all that the ghost and later on the embodied beloved, all that she represents and embodies that gives the house on Bluestone Road its menacing presence, namely slavery and the slave trade. So Beloved is about a past that is so real and traumatic that, slavery and the slave trade, but I think in being written in the 80s, it's also about white institutionalized racism that stems from slavery and the slave trade. So this past is so real and traumatic that Beloved herself becomes a physical being beyond a ghost or a supernatural force that we see in Irving's short story, the way that race serves this sort of chameleon capacity and blends into the environment. Here, Beloved is physical force. She is moving beyond the supernatural, the menacing ghost presence. So thus, Beloved not only criticizes or speaks back to the Anglo-American Gothic genre and its traditional ideologies in their appropriation of the Black body, but it also attempts to explain to readers in its narrative of haunting the historical reality stemming from white oppression. So in conclusion, to again echo Morrison in Playing in the Dark, literature, quote, mystifies what it cannot bring itself to articulate, end quote. Irving's short story mystifies the presence of African-American bodies by extending the use of the color Black beyond skin and into the landscape, objects, and non-human subjects. Gothic tropes such as monstrosity and anxiety are manifest not only in human bodies, but also in the bodies of nature through land, water, air, plants, and animals. So what I hope I began to scratch the surface of is how Morrison, through Playing in the Dark and through her novel Beloved, inverts or engages in an act of signifying upon the Anglo-American Gothic treatment of the African bodies as objects for mediations on terror. Morrison re-envisions the traditional dark and Black colors of landscape and objects that we see in Gothic stories, such as the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and for my own personal interest, later on in Edgar Allan Poe's story as well, and transforms the idea of hauntings to a more embodied one. Thank you for listening. must have been dull without pictures and stuff. But if anyone needs citations or would like direct quotes emailed over to them, just let me know and I can definitely do that.
Okay, thank you, Katrina, so much for your presentation. Even if there weren't any pictures, I found it very, very interesting. So thank you very much. And now we have time for questions for the Q&A session. So if anybody would like to break the ice. Okay, so Katrina, would you like to ask a question?
Anna actually raised her hand. Maybe she should go first. I didn't see the reaction to raise. I'll go after her. She was more polite, so.
Okay, so yeah.
Okay, thank you. Your presentations were very, very interesting, and I think just to have the debate going, I have to say that I really liked what Alissa, in a way, said very well, saying that some bodies and some places are more exploited or are more exploitable in a way. And I think this is very interesting when it connects precisely eco issues and gender issues and also ethnic issues, as in the comic you were talking about. They all mix up in a way, because there's some ethnic sides to it, there's some sexuality sides to it, there's some gender issues and so on. So I thought that was very interesting, and in a way it also connects with this feeling that you and the witch and maybe Carolina a little bit more than Katrina, we have this connection between wild animals or monsters and women. So I would like to ask to each of you how, I don't know, maybe a commentary that pulls this together. So why there are some places are more exploited, and why we connect this with feminist issues, with feminist perspectives. I think that's very interesting. And why the connection, you think, is made often with this relationship between the women and the wild animals, you know? And I think that I don't know much about this, but there's often the kind of wild animal that is often used is the deer or similar animals, that I think also is very interesting. And for example, we talked about this in another panel when we were talking about Hannibal, and there is this image of the deer as a masculine kind of wild animal monster. But in this case, for example, in your comic, the deer is connected to the women of this town. So if you can just say something about this kind of relationship, thank you.
I think there's some really interesting stuff going on with intersectionality that I think everybody's presentation hit on in different ways. So that's a really fascinating through line that we can talk some more about. But I think part of what really strikes me about these intersections is that in some ways it is about who can be exploited, what land can be exploited, but also how can those places and those people claim subversive power. So the women in the Lola Woods, like the witch turns them into these hybrid animal creatures, and we see like the deer creature specifically isn't a doe, isn't a female deer. Like the deer has these big phallic antlers, and so the deer woman sort of has this power that she didn't have before. And I think it's really interesting that that's the character, that's the image that they give us for the one who says like, no, I don't want to remember and I don't want to forget. Like, I'm good how I am now. I want to stay like this. So I think there's some really interesting stuff going on there in those intersections. And I'll open it up to the other panelists to kind of draw some of those connections in the work they talked about as well.
I don't know whether yes, I am, I'm mute. Well, thank you very much to all my my co-panelists, because you're right, okay, there seems to be like a thread, okay, that connects, okay, all our talks. And I'm also interested in the question of hybridity, okay, as a source of monstrosity. I mean, Alissa has mentioned, okay, this strange creature. I've mentioned, I mean, in between, okay, the woman and the deer, and I've mentioned not only the amphibian creature, but also Eliza, the protagonist, who is a mixture, okay, of a fish and a woman. And well, even the patriarchal imaginary, bodily purity, bodily integrity, well, okay, is to be worshipped. I think, okay, this hybrid and monstrous, impure creature, okay, have also a political dimension, okay, and a sort of very transgressive, okay, kind of aspect, okay, that I think is also worth considering.
I think this maybe connects a bit with Cristina's.
Yeah, I wanted to. So Thomasine is the firstborn in the family, and she is, as I said, an adolescent, but she's constantly neglected in the family. She's marginalized. Her mother almost sees her as a sort of a rival, which was in fact very, very weird. And she's from the very beginning considered guilty. She lost her brother. She is guilty because Caleb, her brother, finds her attractive. So she bears this huge burden on her shoulders, probably because, just like nature, is somehow associated with the original sin. Because, well, Eve was the first, woman that sinned, and so at the end of the movie, she has no other choice, in fact, but to become a witch. And all her family dies around her, but they are mostly killed by their own sins. It's the same obsession with sin. It's a Puritan, a movie about Puritans. The same obsession with sinning. So she's left alone, and this is her only choice. I think it's also very much connected to ecofeminism. Now, all those women in the forest, in spite of their, cruelty, they were more free than Thomasine or her mother, that were somehow, you do have this impression that there's this claustrophobic feeling in that family. They don't really breathe there, that you're not free. And of course, I didn't really like the image of the witch killing the baby, but I interpret it as a metaphor, just like I mentioned Dracula's brides, if you remember, they were eating babies. That's I think it's a patriarchal somehow fear. Women that refuse their motherhood, they refuse to be mothers or wives, they choose to be independent, they are somehow monstrous. And and they are in this particular movie hybrids as well, or shapeshifters. They can change a lot. And what I particularly like is this very dichotomous way of seeing women. So nothing in between. They are either monsters or saints, or they are either beautiful, voluptuous, seductive, or just old hags or crones, like in those vanity paintings where you have the beautiful woman and just behind that woman, you have the crone of the old woman. So that was female monstrosity. But I think the mother was more monstrous than the daughter and the other witches. Thank you.
I just think it's very interesting that in the way somehow it's told in the movie, you do have that feeling at the end, like the real monster wasn't her. The real monster wasn't the girl that was somehow leaning with the devil, but it was the context that was oppressing her. And I think that was quite the message, I guess, that was underlined in a way. And it was very interesting. And also there's always this, this monstrosity that is about shape-shifting and being animal in a way, abandoning, in her case, a Puritan context, but it's about abandoning a more human society and just somehow blending with different post-human kind of context. That I think it's very interesting in this three texts, in particular yours and Alissa's. So thank you. If you have
yes, I have a comment for Katrina. I found particularly interesting this sort of transfer you've talked about from, the black body to other black objects or animals or things, okay, in the material dimension. And I remember an article I read, okay, for something completely different, that discussed the fetishistic value of black lingerie or underwear, because somehow all the connotations of the black body, the black female body with, lasciviousness and whatever, all the values, okay, patriarchal and racist, okay, values added to it as sort of transferred, okay, on the white body, okay, that wears, okay, these black garments, okay, and somehow there's all this transfer of meaning too. Okay, so I found this really evoking. Thank you.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I would love to get a hold of that article.
Okay, yes, okay, I will annotate that, okay, if you send my...
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, so that's another affect that comes through black imagery. It's not just fear and dread and evil, but lust, sexuality. That's so fascinating. And I think that ties into, I think it was you, Cristina, who talked about the sort of subliminal space that we exist in our relationship to the environment, our anxieties over the environment, the sort of dread but lust in a way, or love, right, which is the whole essence of abject, right, of that. So that's really fascinating, and I think that could totally, that idea, although it's applied to like lingerie, could definitely be expanded to talk about the environment, especially more contemporary literature where you see this more utopian, pastoral, agrarian sort of love, right? So yeah, thank you, that's great. One thing I wanted to say, or actually two things, it always adds up after more people talk, right? The first thing, I think, Alissa, you're primarily talking about hybridity, and it sort of picked up, and I find that term really fascinating. I have, I don't know if you guys have seen the Nordic Noir TV series Hjortskott, but it's so incredible, and it perfectly touches on all of these issues, these issues of hybridity, of blending, of coexistence, which reminds me so much of Ralph Ederson's Transparent Eyeball, when he talks about blending and becoming one with nature and feeling everything that flows through you. And I think if that's used positively or correctly by like literary texts and pop culture, it can really help draw a distinction between relationality, so hybridity as opposed to relationality, which could be a more, which could be the difference between climate awareness, issues of climate change in our environment and landscape, as opposed to more human-centered relationships. So that blending, that being one, that not necessarily even being one, but just breaking down the boundaries, as opposed to, you know, something like Olafur Eliasson's ice watch installations, when they had like big chunks of ice out on the street in London, I think, and people would go through the installation and gives the sort of imaginary idea of climate change, of physicality, but that's more relational, I think, that sort of installation. It's here, I'm taking a photo in front of it, I see it, but that hybridity sort of goes beyond that and you melt it into the iceberg. So I thought that hybridity was really, really interesting in all of your presentations. And the second point I wanted to raise, Cristina, I found it really interesting. You're talking about you're either monstrous or you're kind of innocent. What about this in between? And that's something that I know I might be poorly rephrasing what you're saying or what you're talking about, but I find that really interesting, primarily from my interest in crime fiction and the way when you start to bring in crimes against the environment, it's not as clear cut as, okay, capitalist structure is evil, nature is the victim, but you have these sort of in-between actors like me who drive, who are completely like eco-friendly, trying to be, you know, there's sort of that built person, right? That participate in these sorts of, I like to think of them as crimes against nature, or violent acts against nature, slow violence to echo Carolina. So that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, so Laura, would you like to make a question?
Yeah, sure. I had a question, but I was wondering if Carolina wanted to answer to Katrina first, maybe. Oh, because you had your hand up, and maybe I thought maybe you wanted to answer her. No, that's fine.
Okay.
So my question, it's maybe mostly to Cristina, because she's the one who spoke about witches, but I think it might connect to all of you a little bit. And I heard in the introduction at the beginning that Alissa has written a book on the Wizard of Oz, which I think it's very interesting how it speaks about the trope of the witch. And I was wondering about how you thought this use of the witch and what Cristina was mentioning before about how this idea of the independent woman becomes kind of threatening, and that's how when it becomes the monstrous female and all this type of issues. And so my question is how this trope or this figure, if you will, or archetype of the witch has been used in more recent cultural productions, because I think that the witch is kind of an exception on how the witch is commonly used in popular culture in the 21st century. And I was thinking specifically about the TV series of Sabrina, because we had a discussion, a couple of presentations on this the other day. And this is a use of the trope of the witch that goes along the lines of a very neoliberal capitalist approach to freedom. Like, I want freedom and power for myself, but there's no underlying kind of connection to the other, to other women, to even to nature maybe, or where that power comes from, right? From liberating oneself or liberating from the system. And I think this also connects very well with Carolina's presentation, because you were also speaking about how the capital thing and all these issues that it's presented in the work that you analyzed.
So Alissa or should answer?
Oh, no, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay. I noticed something, well, for witches, it's similar with all these supernatural creatures. So recent TV series or shows, they humanize them. You know, you have the good vampire or the vampire that wants to be human, but also the witch that is no longer that threatening. But this movie, The Witch, is called a folk tale. Okay, so it's a traditional take on the witch. So the witch is still threatening, and in folklore, the witch continues to be threatening. So I have my grandmother living in the countryside and talking about witches and sinful women. So it's still. But when we are talking about, you know, these recent TV series, witches are definitely, you know, humanized. They are seen as more complex than, you know, the independent, scary women. We call them independent, you know, that follow their whims and they follow their own. Actually, they didn't really have many variants. So yeah. Probably, you know, from our perspective, the witch or becoming a witch is liberating somehow. Yeah. So that was my answer. I hope it was okay.
And I would add, like, looking at it from that larger perspective, kind of beyond the things that we've talked about today. So if we look at The Wizard of Oz, we look at Sabrina, a lot of it is that power, and what is that power used for? Like, what structures is that power used to dismantle instead of uphold? And there seems to be something really eco-Gothic about magic and about witches specifically. Like if we think about women drawing power from nature, whether it's associated with the moon or the elements or, you know, whatever other kind of iconography or narratives we might have that connect women and nature and magic kind of all together. I mean, that's a whole lot of power if we're thinking about like all of the elements and the idea of women with that much power, and that much power that is going to almost always be used to dismantle those unfair systems rather than work to keep them in place or politely critique them. Because there's a lot of fun stuff there.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting issue because I think this this topic came up in other panels several times, and we were speaking about how this softening, maybe we want to call it that, of the monster that Cristina was speaking about comes along with a sort of socio-political approach to horror that goes more in the direction of trying to empathize with the monster, as in trying to empathize with the other rather than opposing us to the othered monster. And I thought that maybe that was something that the witch was doing, but maybe in a too soft way when it comes to connecting maybe too much with a capitalist approach to you know, not being that confrontational in a sense. Thank you for your answers.
Okay, Carolina, did you want to make a question before? No? Okay. So does anybody else have another question for our panelists? No? Well, I wanted to ask a question to Katrina about, because your presentation explored how racial anxieties are conveyed through the color black. So I was wondering, what is your take, or if you have any opinion on Gothic fiction that explores these racial anxieties through supernatural characters or characters that are not Black, so like Carnival Row, I was thinking, that conveys this racial otherness through a mainly white cast. And it's through these supernatural others like fauns or fairies and things like that. So in a way, they are omitting or not representing otherness through Black characters or this color black. So I don't know if you would like to comment on that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. And I think that it would be really useful to think through these things because of, you know, the chameleon capacities of racism, right? To sort of quote Saidiya Hartman in her book Scenes of Subjection, she talks about the way racism, takes on these chameleon capacities. And I think to answer your question, I haven't seen Carnival Row. I think you the name, but I haven't seen that. I'm so behind on TV. But I think that it would be really interesting to examine how the absence of Black imagery, of more obvious aesthetic styles of representing racial anxiety, how the absence of it and the sort of lack of identification markers and stuff like that can be another way to bring about these anxieties and these issues. So I haven't seen, I'm trying to think of maybe another show that could do that. Swamp Thing. I don't know if anyone has seen Swamp Thing. I think it came out in 2019. It was so good, I got the comics, so as well. But I think that's a great show because it takes place in the South. It really draws on Southern Gothic tropes and sort of does a weird, like, kind of Faulkner-esque thing where, I'm thinking of As I Lay Dying, there's no African-American characters, but the tension, the text, the language really draws on the oppressive past that involved enslaving Africans and then African Americans. So taking Swamp Thing as an example, I think it is a pretty dark show. It uses Black imagery, but African American characters are very limited in that show. But I think that through text, through dialogue, through setting, not necessarily landscape or environment, but just setting and climate itself, can be a way to sort of see those racial tensions coming about. I don't know if that really answers your question. If you have thoughts on it, or anybody else, I'd be interested to know as well. Perhaps not just race, but even gender and religious issues as well that aren't seen, aren't there, but they're there. They're in hiding. You kind of have to find your way to that point.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. So would anybody else like to ask anything?
Just one short comment about what Katrina said about the Southern Gothic or Southern America. Southern America, Louisiana is perfect for, discussing nature, eco-Gothic, race relationships, and so feminism, and it's absolutely rich. It's a rich soil for. And I was also thinking about True Blood. I'm writing a paper on True Blood right now about monstrosity and various minorities. So it's very interesting.
One of these landscapes of fear.
Yeah, fear and fascination. So.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Cristina. Any other questions? No. So Anna, I think we could close the session, or well, you're the boss.
I think so. Thank you. It was very, very interesting. Now, if any of our public wants to turn on their cameras just to show our faces to you at closing the session. Also, I was just thinking before we close, when Cristina was talking about the fact that the witches, and at the end, all the men were killed and just the women remained. It came to my mind a comic
And
that I
Black
read.
Philip, the devil, was still there.
Yeah.
Women.
Oh, you're muted.
I said women and the devil, perfect combination.
Yeah, yeah. It's always women and monsters remain alive somehow. And it came to my mind the comic that I've read recently that it's called Eve of Extinction. And it was, I think, 2019, and it has nothing to do with a same name video game. It has absolutely nothing to do. And it's not a very good comic, I have to say. I mean, it's nothing exciting because it has a lot of issues, meaning problems, because the issues are like 6. But I thought it was very interesting that the main thing was this rain. It suddenly starts to rain in this city, and it's the rain that falling on men transforms them into monsters. Only men. Women survive, and women are attacked by these men that somehow meld together. Well, it's not a super plot, it's quite obvious, but I thought it was very interesting that there is this sort of toxic rain that falls on men and just turns men into monsters, and then we have only female characters that remain alive, and they're kind of bashing the brains out of these monsters. So it was quite interesting if you want to check it out, just for the sake of this kind of topic, you know. And also for some reason we did not find out really why this rain was, you know, it gave us a hint of maybe something related to environmental or eco thing, but it's not really developed, so we will never know, I guess. But it was quite interesting that all men died, turned into these awful creatures, and women survived. So it just came to my mind when you were talking about how in the end we only have the women left. The women and the devil. I mean, anyway, I thought it was a very interesting panel, and thank you for your presentations. They were very, very insightful on some aspects, and in particular on issues related with gender, monstrosity, and of course the Ecogothic. So thank you very much, and thanks to our public for being connected today, and thank you again.
Thank you.